Hi, welcome to another episode of the Critical Criminologist. I'm Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. And this week I'm joined by Leigh Goodmark, who is professor of law and director of the Gender Violence Clinic at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. She's also previously the author of A Troubled Marriage, Domestic Violence in the Legal System, but we're here today to talk about this amazing new book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a balanced policy approach to intimate partner violence from University of California Press. I've been having a lot of University of California Press interviews, which is a good sign for them. They're doing some great books. So welcome to the conversation, Leigh.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can you just tell us a little bit about the overview arguments of the book to start with?
Sure. So what the book argues is that intimate partner violence has been primarily approached through the criminal legal system for about the last 40 years, that the criminal legal system has been the primary response to intimate partner violence in the United States. But what I argue is that criminalization isn't deterring intimate partner violence. It's not reducing rates of intimate partner violence. And in fact, it's exacerbating some of the things that are correlated with intimate partner violence. So it may in fact be making the problem worse. What I advocate for is an expansion of the way that we think about our policy responses to intimate partner violence, to think about things like economics, public health, community, and human rights, so that rather than just looking at this problem through one lens, and an ineffective lens at that, we really expand our focus and do some things that might have a chance at slowing intimate partner violence in some way.
Now, the Violence Against Women Act and the sort of the whole mood of the 94 crime bill, would you say that was a big factor in driving the criminal justice response?
So I'd say it was the culmination, actually, of a drive towards the criminal legal system response that really starts in the late 70s and early 80s, picks up significantly in 1984 when three things happen. One is that the Attorney General's Task Force on Family Violence for the first time says intimate partner violence is a criminal problem. It requires a criminal response. When Tracy Thurman wins a $2.3 million judgment against the city of Torrington, Connecticut, after police failed to intervene to protect her from repeated intimate partner violence. And then when Lawrence Sherman and Richard Burke published their study on arrest that argues that arrest may in fact deter recidivist intimate partner violence, a study that they couldn't replicate, as it turned out, with results across the board that were much more complicated. But those three things, coupled with some class action lawsuits that were filed in the late 80s challenging police and prosecutorial failure to intervene, really drove this idea that criminalization should be the primary policy response. So VAWA is kind of the culmination of all of that. It certainly embraces that idea. The VAWA is primarily a funding bill, and the vast majority of the funding in VAWA did go to criminalization. And VAWA forwarded some of the policy approaches that had been fought for the previous 10 years, among them mandatory and preferred arrest.
And this has created a kind of problematic dynamic where organizations that maybe historically were focused on providing community-based services or self-help to survivors of domestic violence become more and more integrated into the criminal justice system, but also to get whatever funding they can get, it happens through this Violence Against Women Act, which has this overall criminal justice orientation.
Yeah, there are a couple of other pots of money that are available to service providers that aren't as closely aligned with the criminal legal system. But the vast majority of the funding does come through the Violence Against Women Act, and most of that funding, as I said, is tied to the criminal legal system in some way. So even if you're getting money as a community-based provider, you may be getting that money to facilitate relationships with law enforcement, to help law enforcement do their work better. And so that's led to what Mimi Kim has called the carceral creep, this idea that service providers could do this dance with law enforcement where they thought they could maintain control and continue to serve clients in a kind of a client-centered, client-empowering kind of way, but found that really the criminal legal system took over and became the leader in that dance.
And also a lot of lobbying at the federal level for services around this issue mean having to also lobby for the criminal justice spending.
That's exactly right. So, one of the ways that you get the Violence Against Women Act in the first place is that in the 94 crime bill, Biden looks at his counsel and says, what do we do for women in the crime bill? And the way that this stuff gets passed is when law and order conservatives work with feminist anti-violence folks who are looking for a hook to get money for services. And it's that strange combination that leads to some of the most significant programs that exist in VAWA. And it's also that strange combination that makes it so hard to undo some of this, because the only way, with all of the trouble that we've had in the last few years, even getting the reauthorization of VAWA, the only way that happens is because money is going to law enforcement.
And this has created some political tensions for the movement more broadly. And we had a chance to discuss this a little bit in DC at the LSA meeting where you did an author meets critic panel, that some people are breaking with the larger historic coalition around support for VAWA because they're no longer willing to back what is primarily a criminal justice appropriation.
Yeah, I'd want to be slightly more nuanced about that. I think that what most of us would say, even those of us who are the strongest critics of the criminal legal response, is that VAWA does a lot of things. And there are things in VAWA that we don't want to lose. The money, for example, that goes to civil legal assistance for folks is really important money. Money that's going into rural programs and shelters and that sort of thing, that's all really important. What we've broken with is that this idea that the vast majority of the funding in VAWA should go towards the criminal legal system. So I'd hate to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but the problem is that it's a really, really big baby. And thinking about how you could have a non-carceral VAWA, I think is the work that the movement needs to be doing.
Now, you've been running this clinic for a number of years, and before that you were involved in these issues and in some extended direct involvement. I mean, how did that actual history of direct involvement in these systems, influence you in terms of writing the book and doing this research?
So I've been representing victims of violence for about 25 years now in one form or another, and I've been a clinical law professor for the last 17. I have been in court day in and day out, watching how these systems impact people on a regular basis. And that's really where these books come from, both the first book, A Troubled Marriage, and this one, come from my experience watching how these systems fail to serve my clients and others well. But the additional kind of layer for this book, for Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, really came when I started representing incarcerated people and got a real sense of what it was like to be incarcerated, and having that experience is, to take Brian Stevenson's phrase, once you get proximate with the problem, it's hard to look at things the same way. And so if you had told me as a 24-year-old brand new law graduate doing divorces for women who had been subjected to violence, that I would come to say that I didn't think that any of those people should go to jail or prison and that criminalization wasn't working, I would have told you that you were crazy. And it's only been because I've watched the system fail in so many different ways and fail to stop violence and come to believe that it's a false promise. And that's why it's so harmful. It is a false promise to victims when we tell them that criminalization is going to help you, when in fact it rarely helps, and sometimes it really hurts, hurting both those who they love and themselves. That I've come to change my views over time. So I bristle a little bit when people say, oh, ivory tower academics. I am a practicing lawyer before I'm anything else. And I am in the court and in the prison, and that's where these ideas come from.
And do you see your clinical students struggling with these same issues?
Yeah, they do, and it's fantastic. So when they sign up for the gender violence clinic, a lot of them think, oh, we're going to prosecute the bad guys. And we want to be prosecutors. And so we're excited to do this work. And then they come in and they get me saying, well, what you're going to do actually is go into a prison and you're going to talk to somebody who's been convicted of a crime about why they should get out. And we represent, I should be clear, in the gender violence clinic, we represent criminalized survivors, people who have been incarcerated for crimes related to their experiences of gender violence in some way. So it's not quite as abrupt a change. But for many of them who've never questioned the wisdom of prosecutors or the ways in which prosecutors do their jobs and interact with people who've been harmed, it's a real eye-opener. One of the best experiences actually that I've had is that one of my students went into an interview, who wants to be a prosecutor, went into an interview and said, do you use material witness warrants to compel testimony from victims of domestic violence? And when they said yes, she said, I can't do that. And that was, she said, a direct result of having been in the clinic and had these conversations about the ways that prosecutors misuse power in these cases.
You mentioned in the book also that you have been influenced in this work by obviously Beth Ritchie's book, Arrested Justice, which is just a tremendous resource for folks, but also people working on the ground like Miriam Kaba, who works with survivors and who's organizing for these kinds of abolitionist community empowerment approaches. I don't think that's standard reading for law faculty or law students. Are you assigning their work to students? How did you come across that work? Are you talking to students explicitly about things like carceral feminism as a framework?
Yeah, yes, and yes. So I came to Beth's work when I started looking at women who used force. And that was back around 2006. Even before I was representing criminalized survivors, this was an area that I had become interested in. And so, I had read in Intersectionality, I had read Kimberly Crenshaw, I had read Angela Harris, and I had read Dorothy Roberts, all of whom I think are brilliant scholars. And they're pretty standard scholars in the legal community. But it was when I found Beth's work, both through Compelled to Crime and Arrested Justice, that I was kind of completely blown away. And Beth has been an unbelievable impact, has had an unbelievable impact on my work. I've only come to Miriam's work more recently because I've become involved with the Survived and Punished movement. And so there is nationally a movement looking at the criminalization of survival and asking, why is it that we think it's appropriate to incarcerate people who've committed crimes related directly to their own survival, and how do we get them out? That's the work I do on a day-to-day basis. It's also the work I'm doing now. I'm actually working on a book now on the criminalization of survival. And then I would be completely remiss if I didn't say Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class. If you haven't read it, that has to be the starting point. I'm embarrassed at how late that I came to it, but it's pretty much my Bible.
And Abolition Democracy, I think, is a seminal text for those of us who do this work. So a lot of people have been, well, actually, let me go back for a second. So within the book, you talk about different frameworks for thinking about domestic violence outside of the criminal legal system. You talk about community level interventions, economic interventions, and also human rights interventions. So I think we can see, most of us can probably imagine, what an economic analysis might look like, that domestic violence is tied to poverty and a lack of reach. But could you tell us a little bit about what a human rights framework adds to this conversation?
Absolutely. So the human rights framework is a little bit different. The other three chapters, the economics chapter, the public health chapter, and the community chapter, are all about kind of tangible interventions. The human rights chapter is really about a framework. So if you look at human rights law, they talk about something called the 5 Ps in connected with intimate partner violence. And that's prevention, protection, prosecution, punishment, and the provision of reparations. And so the reason that I talk about that human rights frame is to get us to think more broadly about what we could be doing in response to intimate partner violence. And that if we did more of the prevention and more of the protection, and then provided reparations in different ways than we currently understand punishment, we could do a lot less of the prosecution and the punishment. So it's really just about shifting or widening our lens and thinking differently about the various ways that we might go at attacking this problem.
And where did you come up with this, or what were your influences for this human rights framework?
I had done some work on the Human Rights at Home movement, or with the Human Rights at Home movement. My good friend Carrie Bettinger Lopez has done a tremendous amount of work thinking about how we take the decision that she helped to get in an Inter-American Commission on Human Rights case called Lenahan versus United States, which involves Jessica Lenahan. And I could get really into the kind of law professory weeds now. Jessica Lenahan was was Jessica Gonzalez when she brought her case to the Supreme Court, arguing that the town of Castle Rock had failed her by failing to investigate the breach of her protective order, which led either directly or indirectly to the death of her 3 children. She lost at the Supreme Court. And then Kerry took her case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which found that freedom from domestic violence is a fundamental human right. The problem was that once you get a decision from the Inter-American Commission, there's not a whole lot that you can do to enforce it. So some of us started thinking about what can we do with this? And another friend, Margaret Drew, came up with an idea to try to get a local human rights finding from her city council. And so a number of us then got these resolutions passed by city councils that said freedom from domestic violence is a fundamental human right. That's how I got engaged in the human rights piece of it, really in thinking about what are the tangible things we can take out of Lenahan and use to make policy changes to benefit our clients.
And this involves, dipping your toes into, the legislative process and maybe a little bit of electoral politics. I mean, how do you understand the role of that kind of power politics in what you're trying to do, as opposed to, using a legal framework for addressing these issues?
I have always thought as an advocate that lawyers have lots of tools at their disposal, and one of them is litigation, but it's only one. Public policy is another tool, community education and organizing is another tool, and the best lawyers know how to use all of those tools. So for as long as I've been practicing, I've also been doing legislative work. I've also been doing work in city councils, trying to get local legislation. I've done national legislative work. It's all of those things in tandem that I think really matter. I'll say I find that every couple of years I have to take a break from legislative work because it will make you absolutely crazy. And we don't have the capacity really to drive legislation. We're not in those halls day in and day out. I'm teaching students and I'm doing other kinds of work. But our students get this really rich experience from doing some of the lobbying, and we generally work in coalition with other groups who are interested in the same kinds of things. I think that's really important too, is that if you're doing something in isolation, it's probably not a great, it's a bad idea to do things without the input of the affected community. If you're doing something in isolation, it means you don't have that input yet. And so we do a lot of work in coalition. But the problem with those power politics is that it's hard to stay pure. So yeah. I have what is a fairly radical position on all of this now, as opposed to much of the national movement. And so if I'm doing that work in the context of, say, the Violence Against Women Act, it raises questions about what am I willing to give up, because I know that I can't get it passed. And I think those are really hard questions.
And how are you navigating that conflict with the larger movement? Are you trying to convince them? Are you trying to organize an independent political constituency to go around them? How are you managing that?
What's really amazing, actually, is that there is a huge movement now away from the carceral system, away from carceral feminism, and towards the idea that criminalization has not served us particularly well. And so lots of state coalitions now are doing work on alternatives to criminalization. There are many academics who are doing this work now. So it's really not, I'm not doing this in isolation. And we're having these conversations about, what is possible, and then what is kind of the perfect, and trying to talk to the people who are still in the very hard position of trying to get any VAWA passed, about what a better VAWA might look like and how we might aspire to other kinds of things. I don't think that there's anyone in the movement, that's not true, I can think of one person, but aside from that person, there are very few people in the movement who ever thought criminalization was the only thing we should be doing. And some of that, some of the reason that criminalization became as influential as it was about the ability to get anything passed. So people are at various places among the spectrum in terms of where they think, for example, police should be, or the role of incarceration. And there are abolitionists and there are hardcore people, but I think there are a whole lot of people in between. And so it's just a matter of trying to have that conversation. But I've been really heartened by the conversations that I've been hearing in the last couple of years, because I think there is true movement on this, and true movement coming from the grassroots. The other thing to say, which I think is always important to say, is that women of color from the beginning were saying this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea for us. This is a bad idea for our communities. It's not going to work well. The mainstream movement didn't listen particularly well to women of color who were saying those things, and I think is doing a better job of listening now.
That's so important, because at that time, there were these really big rifts within the feminist movement, et cetera, that we still have a lot of work to repair. And I think one of the areas where we still see this is around the issue of sex work decriminalization.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's maybe talk a little bit about what this would look like. There's always this pushback. There was some commentary on the Twitter. We had some Twitter conversation before this interview about, well, it's already decriminalized because, domestic violence offenders don't get punished enough. So how can you talk about less punishment? If you want to be equal, then we need more punishment of those offenders. So we're in a situation right now with the lockdown where there's a growing number of complaints about domestic violence. This seems obvious to a lot of people that this would be the case. How should we be responding to those upticks in these problems?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's really hard. There's that there will be an uptick in intimate partner violence during an event like this, right? You're isolated with someone. Some of the correlates, economic stress and trauma, are all going through the roof, which makes it completely unsurprising that you would see an uptick in violence. The problem is that at this point, if you put someone in jail, that has the potential to be sentencing them to life or to death, really.
To death, yeah.
For the commission of a misdemeanor. And that just can't be the right response. So there are lots of things we could think about. In France right now, women who are calling for assistance are being put in hotels to get them away from their abusive partners. One might think about doing the opposite, which is to take people who are using violence and putting them in a hotel while you leave the person to shelter in the place that they are familiar with and comfortable in, particularly if there are children. So that's one resource.
There are a lot of empty hotels right now.
There are a lot of empty hotels right now. One could do that. Mutual aid, which I know that Mariam Kaba and Dean Spade, among others, have been talking about quite a bit. What people don't understand when they say we should punish people more is that only about half of intimate partner violence is ever reported to law enforcement in the first place, which means that families, friends, community members are the ones who are first responders in those cases. So we need to call on those same first responders to say, can you help out? Can you check in? Can you provide food? Can you provide rent money? How can we help each other try to deal with some of the correlates that are driving some of this violence? Can we make service provision available remotely? I mean, I'm teaching remotely. There's no reason that people who do work with those who use violence can't be doing that work remotely as well. How do we make that broadly available so that people have someplace they can call in and say, I feel like I need some help right now? And how do we normalize asking for help? To say, when you feel like you're being driven towards violence, here's something else that you could do. We can think about policing differently, though I'm a little skeptical because of the way that we train and kind of hire police in the United States. But if we thought about police as violence interrupters rather than those who are charged with arresting and incarcerating, we might do some work there to say, you could go just to help stop this in the moment, but it doesn't mean an arrest necessarily needs to happen. We could listen to those who've been hurt when they say, please don't take this person out of the home because that's going to cause a lot more hardship to me than leaving them here. Thank you for stopping this in the moment, but I do need this person around. We could do what we do with foster care, which is to look for kin who are willing to take somebody in for some period of time. I think we are only limited by our creativity. And the thing about getting out of a criminalization mindset is that we are stymied by fear so much of the time. If we stop criminalizing, someone will die. And the reality is that we have a robust criminal legal response and people die all the time as a result of intimate partner violence. So if we want to take this opportunity to say, right now is the worst time that you could arrest someone, right? The rate of infection on Rikers is multiple times greater than the entire country, than any place in the country. So it's an unbelievably dangerous time to put somebody into one of those facilities. What else can we be doing? I just think there are a lot of things we could be doing.
It's dangerous even in the best of times, of course. That's a milieu where violence is normative, and people often become more traumatized, which is, of course, a contributing factor here. In the mental health community, there's a lot of talk about developing non-police 24-hour crisis response capabilities. This includes looking at violence interrupter models that are completely civilian. So is there talk about that in the domestic violence movement?
I talk about it in the book, and I talk about it because I'm in Baltimore. And Safe Streets Baltimore has done a really terrific job around violence interruption. These are folks who've had experience with the criminal legal system, who are going out into community and intervening with people who they often know to try to stop violence in the moment. What's interesting about Safe Streets is when I talked to them, they said so many of their cases start as intimate partner violence, which I could not believe. But they said, absolutely, that's true. So there is violence interruption happening in intimate partner violence cases already. We're just not talking about it that way. So I'm a big believer in that.
And people don't know that that resource exists for that specific kind of a problem. And, violence interrupters often don't get involved until there's already been some violence. So if people knew they could call 911 or another number and get a non-police response, we might even see much higher rates of people asking for help.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are so many reasons that people don't want to engage the criminal legal system. And our ability to work around that problem is going to be essential in providing services to those who are never going to engage the state for any reason.
Could you say a little bit more about these movements to create kind of personal inventories of resources and support, what some people call pod mapping?
I actually don't know that much about pod mapping. And what I know, I've learned just from listening to Mariam Kaba and Dean Spade talk about it. But I think the idea behind it is just to kind of assess within the community what the sources of support are, what the strengths are, where are the places where you can get resources, and kind of going from there, then how do you connect people with those resources? But it's not something that I am as well versed on as I'd want to be.
Well, in my understanding, also at the individual level, it would also involve an inventory of like, who personally could I call to help me out in different kinds of situations? You mentioned like the importance of relying on kin in these child welfare cases, but also who is the uncle of my partner who I might be able to call who could help interrupt this bad dynamic?
So for me, that intersects, and I think about that in two different ways. One is, traditionally service providers who work with folks who've been harmed by their partners call that safety planning. And we do that kind of safety planning with all of our clients. Where can you go? Who can you call? Who can you rely on? Where are your documents? Where is your emergency cash? So thinking about that personal inventory rate that you have at your disposal if there's harm is something that we do all the time. The other piece of that kind of dovetails with some of the work that I've done is around restorative justice and thinking about what are the community-based resources that you can put into place to keep you safe. And around community accountability work. So Mimi Kim, who I mentioned before, started the Bay Area organization called Creative Interventions. And the whole goal of Creative Interventions was to enable people who'd been harmed to come in and say, this is what I need. And then to help people figure out, okay, how do you get what you need? How do we create a phone tree so that if we need to get somebody to you immediately, there'll be somebody in place to make that phone call? How do we find the one person who might be able to talk to your partner and really get them to see why what they're doing is problematic? Whose couch can we send him to stay on if we need him out of the house for a little bit? That kind of thing. And so we've been thinking about that in those terms for quite a while.
You mentioned before that sometimes victims, survivors are reluctant to have the perpetrator removed from the home in part because they rely on that person financially, et cetera. So what can be done economically to create more independence for survivors, but also to address the kinds of underlying economic factors that may be driving the violence in the first place?
Yeah, so for people who've been harmed, for people who've been hurt, right, one of the things we don't do is just put money in their hands. And one of the things I'd love us to think about is cash transfer. How do we just get more resources into people's hands? So if what is keeping them in an abusive situation is money, that's a problem we can deal with. And there are various ways that people have done that, mostly overseas. And there's some evidence that cash transfer programs have a positive impact on the perpetration of intimate partner violence. When you get more resources into the home, you can both decrease violence and give people economic power. So I write about that. I write a little bit about microfinance, although the evidence around that is a little more fraught.
Yeah.
I write about work and the importance of work and giving people the ability to have skills that they need when they transition out of an abusive relationship. And there are shelter-based programs that are trying to provide real concrete work experiences and opportunities so that when people go out into community, they have something to build on. But there are also macroeconomic kinds of things to talk about and think about, right? It's not surprising that with the kind of rise of globalization and the lack of industrial work in the United States, we're seeing intimate partner violence rates that are problematic. Male under and unemployment is probably the most highly correlated factor with intimate partner violence. So getting jobs for men, and that's, I should say, that's binary, that's in heterosexual relationships. There's a lot more complexity to this, but that research specifically is about men in heterosexual relationships where the men are being abusive. And so getting those men jobs, getting those men work may be the single most important thing we can do. The Obama administration looked at the minimum wage and found that if you increase the minimum wage only a little bit, just slightly, you could decrease crime by a significant percentage. I think that decrease would happen in intimate partner violence as well. So thinking about how we retrain men who've lost work, thinking about how we increase the resources available to the family, all of those things are going to go far to help us decrease intimate partner violence.
Well, and the current, economic free fall that we're in has really brought issues like a universal basic income back onto the political agenda. I think not sufficiently, and of course, not in a way that the Trump administration or Republicans in the Senate would go along with, but at least it brings it back into the conversation, and I assume that that would be something you would support.
I would absolutely support it. It's funny to think that the last time there was a decent shot at it was under Nixon, right? If you think about where the Republican Party has gone on this issue. But yeah, absolutely. If everyone we know that economics drives intimate partner violence. That's absolutely undeniable. Its rates of intimate partner violence are higher in homes where there is poverty, higher where people feel financial strain. If we can alleviate some of those conditions, we can decrease violence. I have no doubt about
that. You mentioned at the Author Meets Critic session that I attended that you've been doing some rethinking about your claims at the very end of the book that maybe full decriminalization isn't actually where we want to go, that this was more of a rhetorical intervention. Where are you feeling right now about that?
I feel embarrassed about the fact that I keep having to admit that I chickened out at the end of the book. So I will say, so at the end of the book, what I say is decriminalizing domestic violence is unlikely and probably unwise. I still think that it's unlikely. I no longer think that it's probably unwise. I didn't commit strongly enough. And I wasn't quite there yet. But again, having worked with incarcerated people for the last 6 or 7 years and really spent time thinking about what it means to cage someone and what that looks like. I'm in a prison probably twice a month, and I'm in a pretty decent prison as prisons go. And yet, when I'm in that prison, all I can think about is we shouldn't treat people this way. Mm-hmm. There's no moral justification for doing this. And so then, when I put on my lawyer hat and I think, well, why is it that we're doing this? So we have justifications for punishment. We have rationales for punishment, right? So if we've got 4 rationales for punishment, it seems to me 3 of them are completely useless in the context of incarceration, right? Incarceration doesn't deter anybody. The social science research bears that out pretty strongly. We're not rehabilitating anyone who's incarcerated anymore. And I don't think retribution is a valid basis for punishment, though many people do, which leaves us with incapacitation. And so if your goal is just to keep somebody out of society for a while, yeah, I guess prison's a good way to do that. I'm not sure it's a valid goal. And so I still think it's unlikely. I still think that it's important to do the work. And part of that was introducing a section of the book that says, if we're going to incarcerate people, we need to understand that the punishment is the loss of liberty, not the loss of dignity, not the loss of safety. And so doing that work around prison reform, I think to the extent that prisons continue to exist is important. And I recognize that puts me in a different place than some abolitionists who think if you do that work, then you're just facilitating the ongoing existence of prisons. But it's hard for me when I look at how my clients are living not to want to do that work. But ultimately, I can't feel good about a system in which we cage people. And I think there are a number of folks in the anti-violence movement who have found that this is an issue where 2 of their very closely held beliefs come into tension. So one closely held belief for many progressive people is that mass incarceration is a huge problem and is morally wrong. But the other is that we have to take violence against women seriously. And the only way that we understand to take violence against women seriously is to incarcerate people, is to use the criminal legal system. And when those 2 things come into tension, people don't really know what to do with that. And for me, the place where that's taken me to is we don't need to lock people up. We need to help people change. We need to alleviate the conditions that lead to violence. We need to think about other kinds of interventions that don't involve inflicting violence on people, ironically, for having committed violence.
Often I find that what that tension produces is a series of half measures, like drug courts, or in this case, like domestic violence courts, where you have court mandated treatment or the constant threat of incarceration, whether it's a probation or parole situation or court mandated treatment, so that there's always the threat of punishment and incarceration looming over the dynamic.
I think that's right. And I think what's interesting is even some of the writing around restorative justice and intimate partner violence anticipates incarceration as the ultimate stick that can be used if nothing else works. The other piece of this that I think is interesting and that I've been thinking about more is the use of electronic surveillance, because that, this idea that we can use probation and parole as a substitute for incarceration assumes that those don't inflict harms. Chaz Arnett, who's a scholar who does a lot of work on electronic monitoring, and I have been having this conversation back and forth about what does this look like in the context of intimate partner violence, because not surprisingly, that's kind of the step down that people see. Well, we don't have to really lock people up. We can just shackle them with an ankle bracelet and that'll be okay. And it really isn't. It perpetuates some of the same harms.
This is one of my concerns, is that we framed a lot of our advocacy against the criminal justice system in terms of prison abolition, which has taken the form of like bricks and mortars prisons. As you said, no one should be held in those conditions. But I think it's a tougher leap to talk about things like police abolition or the abolition of the criminal justice system writ large, because then we lose access to these backstops, these intermediate steps that people have come to rely on as they begin to see the futility of relying on incarceration. So I like that. One of the things I liked about your book is that it does not fall back on, well, then we just need more of a role for police, more of a role for electronic surveillance, more of a role for, non-carceral supervision.
Yeah, I think all of those things are deeply problematic. And I'm at least proud that I didn't end up there. And in the book, talk a little bit about the problem with, for example, the overuse of probation, which I think people have documented. It's a huge issue. Unless and until we find solutions that exist entirely outside of the carceral system, entirely outside of the criminal legal system, we're not going to have the impact that we want to have. And as long as we have the criminal system to fall back on, there won't be the fearlessness that's needed to try something else. And people are so afraid of trying anything new because what if it fails? Well, it will fail, right? Everything does. The only way that we'll learn is by trying and failing. And the idea that we could have a perfect system that we could just somehow put right into place is really kind of silly. I understand that fear. Those are my clients. I have those fears for my clients. The hardest question that I get is, okay, well, if not prison, what? And I'll tell you that, I have one client who I think about all the time whose partner is really scary. And I worry about when he's out, because when he's out, he is a danger to her. And I don't 100% know what to do with him yet. And I'd like to think that at least I have enough humility to say, you know what, I don't have all of these answers. But if you accept my premise, which is that the criminal legal system isn't working and there are other things we could try, then we can start from there. And there are things I didn't think of that we could try too. And the goal for me is to have that conversation. If you accept that it isn't working, here are my ideas. What are your ideas? How do we come up with something that looks better than this and works better than this?
Yeah, we all struggle with trying to figure out what the sort of non-reformist reforms would be, the reforms that lead us in the right direction. So clearly it's not, more police, more training for police, more resources for police. It's how can we shift the emphasis to developing these non-police responses, which are all going to be experimental.
Right.
And they're not going to work perfectly. And also they shouldn't be premised on the possibility of some zero risk, imagined possibility, whether it's sex work or drugs or whatever. This is the importance of like a public health harm reduction strategy that says, yes, there's no system where all violence will come to an end. But what can we do concretely to reduce that risk in ways that don't produce worse problems?
Yeah, and I think that's what people forget when they say, but somebody could die, is that, there are people who do everything right, air quotes, everything right. They get protective orders, they prosecute criminally, and they still get killed. Yep. Because there is no perfect system. And so thinking about how then we address this problem, I think has to acknowledge that from step one. If we don't acknowledge that, then we fail. Immediately, we fail.
Yeah. Well, have you been reading anything interesting that you want to recommend to folks on this extended shut-in?
I read incessantly. It is my single biggest pleasure in life. And so I made myself a list. I'm going to look over at my other screen so that I can look at my list so that I can tell you what I've been reading. So in this space, in the space of stuff we've been talking about, Emily Thuma, All Our Trials, is fantastic.
Yes.
Catherine Jacquet has a new book out called The Injustices of Rape that tracks the anti-rape movement for 1950 to 1980 and looks at the ways in which the movement for Black liberation and the anti-rape movement kind of crossed and conflicted and worked together. It's really fascinating. Hadar Aviram's Yesterday's Monsters, which looks at the Manson parole hearings as a way of talking about the parole system and the brokenness of parole, really resonated with me because of all the parole work that we do. And then my friend Aya Gruber has a book coming out called The Feminist War on Crime that I think is a really nice companion to mine. And she and I have been in conversation about these things since we were both brand new law professors. And then for pleasure reading,
sure.
On intimate partner violence, Carmen Maria Machado's book, In the Dream House, is a memoir of her experience with intimate partner violence. I generally don't read that stuff for pleasure, but it is such a beautiful book. And Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, because that, if anybody's been following the Thomas Cromwell series, this is the last one, and it's fantastic.
Well, I'm really excited for the Gruber book because it's really sounds like it's going to be an in-depth look at carceral feminism and what we could be doing instead. And I think that's a really well-timed intervention. Also a big fan of All Our Trials and hoping to talk to her at some point on the show.
Yeah, Aya's book is great. I've read it, and I think it's fantastic. And Emily Thuma's book is fantastic. So I just feel lucky to be writing about this stuff at a time when so many people are writing in parallel and complementary ways, and I'm benefiting so much from all their work.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today to talk with us. And for those of you listening, you can click the little icon with my picture to subscribe to the podcast. And there are new episodes every Tuesday, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye.